Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the Green Energy Consumers Alliance team for partnering with us and to our speakers for joining us today. My name is Cora Weisbord. I'm one of the facilitators of the Massachusetts Building Electrification Accelerator. Kate Marcelino from the Green Energy Consumers Alliance and Ann Wright from the Building Electrification Accelerator will also help facilitate today's event. Next slide, please. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. We're recording the event. We're going to share the recording and the presentation link after. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentations, so please add your questions to the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. Next slide, please. So a little context to set the stage. We need to ensure that renters are not left behind as we transition away from fossil fuels. We also need to make sure that the unique needs and perspectives of renters are present in any policy and program decisions that affect their homes. Renters often have little control over their homes, and making efficiency and electrification improvements may be difficult or prohibited for many renters. Landlords, especially in competitive rental markets, may have little incentive to invest in their rental properties and to make major property upgrades. The American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy found that nationally, rental homes are less energy efficient than owner-occupied homes, consuming about 15% more energy per square foot. Renters also have high energy burdens. Nearly a third of renters are spending more than 6% of their income on energy bills. So today we're going to hear from policy experts and practitioners about ways to engage and support renters as we weatherize and electrify buildings. We're going to start with two policy overview presentations, one national and one focused on Massachusetts, before hearing two detailed case studies of process and policy design, one from Boston and one from Burlington, Vermont. First, we're going to hear from Alex Jara with ACEEE, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. Alex will present on resources from the Energy Equity for Renters initiative, including a roundup of national policies designed to support and protect renters. Next, Loie Hayes with the Green Energy Consumers Alliance will discuss two types of policies currently in process in Massachusetts, the proposed clean heat standard and buildings performance standards, and how these policies must be designed in ways that support renters. Our final two speakers will share more in-depth case studies from their work. Dwayne Tyndall with Alternatives for Community and Environment will speak about his experience engaging renters in designing Boston's building emissions reduction and disclosure ordinance. And finally, Jack Hansen with Run on Climate is going to describe his experience as a city councilor creating and implementing energy efficiency standards for rental buildings in Burlington, Vermont. And then we'll move to our Q&A. Next slide, please. So to get us started today, we're going to hear from Alex Jara. Alex assists with research on ACEE's local policy team and contributes to the City Clean Energy Scorecard and the Energy Equity for Renters initiative. Prior to joining ACEE in 2019, Alex worked with the American Council on Renewable Energy and the American Sustainable Business Council. Alex, thank you for joining us and for getting us started today. And I will let you take it from here.
Sure. Next slide, please. So yeah, my name is Alex Jara. I'm a local policy research analyst at ACEE. As Cora mentioned, focus mostly on the City Clean Energy Scorecard and our Energy Equity for Renters initiative, which is a technical assistance-based initiative where we assisted 5 communities with their energy efficiency policies for rental housing. Next slide, please. A little note about ACEEE. We are a nonprofit research organization. We have teams focused for each level of government. So we have a state team, a federal team, but we also have teams that are more sector focused. So we have a buildings team, a transportation team, and we are mostly focused on policy research and analysis. Next slide, please. So the agenda for today, I'm just going to discuss a couple of resources tied to our Energy Equity for Renters initiative. I'll then discuss some of the policy options covered in those resources, so y'all get a sense of what those resources are actually about. And then lastly, some other strategies that we cover in the resources. Next slide, please. The two main resources I'm going to be going over are our rental guide, which you see on the left. This is what kicked off the Energy Equity for Renters initiative. And then we also have an Energy Equity for Renters toolkit. And this was a product of the technical assistance we provided those 5 cities. We noticed they had a lot of similar requests in terms of technical assistance. So we put together this resource and made it available publicly. The toolkit is also available in Spanish and Vietnamese. And there's also a fact sheet based on the toolkit available in several other languages. Next slide, please. So yeah, energy equity for renters policy option resources. You can just go over to the next slide. Thank you. So first policy we discussed our building performance standards. These really help bridge the gap in the split incentive. However, when you talk about affordable multifamily housing, particularly naturally occurring affordable housing, there needs to be some extra support there to make sure you don't lead to inequitable outcomes like higher rents and displacement and things of that nature. So some of the strategies we get into for ways that local governments can support the affordable housing sector comply are technical and financial assistance, extended compliance deadlines, and assistance funding contractors and creating stuff like trusted contractor lists. We also talk about grants with affordability covenants, which we see are popping up with more frequency around the country. These essentially require recipients of energy efficiency incentives to maintain affordability at the property for X number of years. It's usually between like 3 to 5 years that we keep seeing. One thing we note when it comes to these policies is that the agreement should specify that the money will be used to upgrade the unit and it won't be used for anything else. Next slide, please. Another policy we get into is the opportunity to purchase. So these are tools that guarantee renters the opportunity to purchase their building if the property owner plans to sell it. As the now property owner, the former renter can make the energy efficiency improvements necessary. An example of this would be in Tacoma Park, Maryland, where they do have a rental, an opportunity to purchase act that applies to renters. But the interesting thing about Tacoma Park's policy is that not only does it apply to renters, but it also applies to nonprofit housing providers. So after the property owner makes the offer to the renter, if the renter refuses, the Tacoma Park policy requires the property owner to then make an offer to like a nonprofit housing organization or a community-based organization to see if they want to purchase the property. Another policy we highlight are renter right to make improvements. So these are policies that make explicit the renter's right to make non-permanent improvements to the rental property. So the scope of these may include improvements such as like door sweeps, foam and socket insulation, pipe insulation, windows, drapes and curtains, plug load technologies. And a great example of this is Hartford, Connecticut, where they have adopted this policy. And I'll get into this later, but you can check our policy tracker tied to the initiative for more in-depth description of these policies. Next slide, please. So rental energy use disclosures, these provide renters with access to a unit's past energy use data and the costs associated with the unit's electricity and natural gas use. This creates a market for rental units with energy efficiency features because renters know how much they're going to be paying in utility costs. So a great example of this would be Austin, Texas, Gainesville, Florida, and Minneapolis. Chicago's policy is mostly tied to heating, whereas the other policies are sort of comprehensive energy costs. And then there are the promotion of state and utility incentives. So this is just a strategy that local governments can employ to overcome knowledge barriers when it comes to energy efficiency programs and incentives. One thing we keep hearing is that a lot of property owners just don't know the landscape when it comes to things like incentives, rebates, ways that just the stakeholders can support property owners to make improvements. And if you want examples of this, you could check out Fort Collins or again, Hartford, Connecticut. Next slide, please. So other strategies we cover in the toolkit, stakeholder and community engagement. The rental guide is covers a lot more of the foundational and conceptual components of stakeholder and community engagement. Whereas the toolkit provides more in-depth strategies to target specific stakeholders such as the property owner, building staff, and renters. I would say starting with the rental guide could be very valuable. There is a lot in that resource on community engagement, and it also just lays out the different types of like the difference between stakeholder engagement, public outreach, community engagement, so on and so forth. And then financing and funding options for energy efficiency retrofits. This is something we cover in the toolkit, but we essentially provide ways for local governments to address financing and funding obstacles for energy efficiency retrofits. We identify roles for local governments that they can take to help address those. Next slide, please. And as I alluded to earlier, this is our policy tracker. So if you are interested in any of the examples highlighted in this presentation, feel free to head to our Energy Equity for Renters landing page. You should be able to find the policy tracker from there. It essentially just covers all the rental energy efficiency policies that we believe will lead to equitable outcomes.
Thank you so much for setting the stage for us this morning and outlining such a wide variety of policy options. I would really encourage everyone on this call to look at ACEE's Energy Equity for Renters website. The resources are really comprehensive and amazing. Next, we are going to hear from Loie Hayes. Loie has been organizing on climate issues since 2005. She led energy conservation workshops and other local climate events in many of Boston's neighborhoods as the coordinator of the Boston Climate Action Network and as outreach coordinator for Renew Boston. She has served on the City of Boston's Community Advisory Committee on Climate Action and on the steering committee of the Green Justice Coalition. Loie has worked at Green Energy Consumers Alliance since 2013 and previously worked in book and newspaper publishing for 20 years. Loie, thank you so much for being here, and we're looking forward to learning about these two policies.
Always a pleasure to join you. Go ahead to the next slide. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the benefits that renters can see from building performance standards and clean heat standards, and in particular, what's happening in the state of Massachusetts. Next slide, please. So an overview of building performance standards. Of course, we know the adage, you can't manage what you don't measure. So this is all about measuring first and foremost. And of course, we can't meet our climate goals without mandating improvements for existing buildings, especially the rental units. Existing buildings, 70% of the existing buildings will still be in operation in 2050 when all of buildings need to be fossil fuel free. So that's a lot of buildings that we have to renovate. And building owners are not going to do that on their own free will if there aren't mandates. So building performance standards level the playing field between property owners. The largest buildings, that have the most capacity have to comply first. And the standards kind of structure advanced planning for building owners. They know, the levels that they have to get to at different benchmarks. And most importantly, the disclosure element of the building performance standards makes the energy cost public so that renters have some choice, and it inhibits, to some degree, landlords from competing with low rents that also are correlated with poor quality or high energy burden. It is a leveling of the playing field in many ways and empowering of renters. Next slide, please. So emissions from rental properties is a huge climate problem. In Boston, for example, 60% plus of residential units are occupied by renters. And as we know, the landlord-tenant split incentive means that landlords have no self-interest in improving properties, and there has to be some force exerted to affect these investments, and there has to be a smart force applied so that those investments don't result in displacement. So building performance standards force landlords to decarbonize, sets that regular benchmarks. The disclosure gives tenants power of choice and levels the playing field so there isn't a race to the bottom in terms of the quality of housing that's available. Next slide, please. So this is a map showing where we are with building performance standards now. You'll see Boston is purple, which means that both the benchmarking aspect and the requirement for reductions are now in place. Massachusetts is in orange because benchmarking is in place, but we don't yet have a mandate for reductions. And that is the struggle that we're at now on the statewide level, is to make that leap from benchmarking to requiring reductions. Next slide, please. So where we're at now, Boston and Cambridge have passed ordinances requiring disclosure and now requiring, mandating reductions in emissions or in the carbon intensity of the buildings. Boston is in the middle of drafting regulations to mandate reductions. So the mandates are in place and being enforced, but the enforcement mechanism regulations is still being written because we haven't hit the deadline yet for actually enforcement measures. Dwayne may be able to speak more to these in his presentation. So Massachusetts has passed the law mandating reporting, and we are advocating for mandates for reductions. And these are the two bills that are in the legislature now. We don't have a lot of co-sponsors, and we're obviously looking for organizing more public pressure for that. Next slide, please. Moving on to clean heat standard. So this is basically mandating that all of the companies that currently provide gas, oil, propane, etc., for heating will be required to meet certain benchmarks for reducing the GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions associated with their products, and they would document their compliance with these standards by earning clean heat credits that they would earn by funding electrification and energy efficiency projects. Next slide, please. So they'll have multiple options. They can help their own customers in exchange, for creating these credits, for generating these credits. They can partner with another company. Say an oil delivery company can partner with a heat pump installation company and buy credits from them, or they can pay a non-compliance fee, which would go into the funding energy efficiency that would help people electrify. Next slide, please. So this is all, the clean heat standard is all just proposed status in Massachusetts, and there are equity provisions that are under discussion in the shaping of that policy. We're pushing for 40% of the clean heat credits to be coming from improvements made in low and moderate income housing. There's a proposal for DOER to even require services to low and moderate income houses sooner than other categories of housing. And there's a proposal to set up an equity advisory group, to further guide the process of making sure that as the clean heat standard is rolled out, low and moderate income households are protected from increased energy burden and displacement. Next slide, please. The powerful thing about the clean heat standard is that it is potentially scaled to the moment. There's as we've talked about, a massive transformation that needs to happen in terms of how we keep people warm in New England winters. And this is really um, a, a comprehensive mechanism for holding the fossil fuel companies financially responsible for funding that transition. And it would leverage both existing and new construction, which is so powerful. Next slide, please. So where are we at now? This clean heat standard could be implemented through the executive branch. We believe they have the authority um, uh, without passing new laws. And the Healy administration and the Mass DEP are actively engaged in a process of um, stakeholder engagement on what would a clean heat standard need to look like, what would be effective, what would be fair, etc. And in the legislature, there is a bill which has 30 co-sponsors, which is good. It's currently in the TUE committee, but we don't have a hearing date set. And of course, we as advocates need to watchdog that bill to make sure that it's strong enough to compel a complete shift to net zero by 2050. And I believe that's all of my slides. Is that right, Kate? You want to forward one? Well, we are about green energy consumers, a nonprofit, and we engage in both programs and advocacy. And there's my contact information. I think that's all for me. Oh, a blog. We do have 3 blog posts that I can recommend, and you can find our URL there. And that, I think, is all from us. Yeah, great. Over to Dwayne then, or over to Cora to introduce Dwayne.
Chloe, thank you for sharing these policy opportunities with us. Next, we're going to hear from Dwayne Tyndall. Dwayne is the Executive Director of Alternatives for Community and Environment. He has over 25 years of professional experience in economic development, community and neighborhood development, youth development, and workforce development. Throughout his professional experience, Dwayne has effectively led capable and diverse teams and has also been able to communicate complex public policies to various stakeholders to show how community-based partnerships can build stronger communities and empower residents and businesses to take active roles in their neighborhoods. Dwayne, thank you for sharing your experience and expertise with us today.
You're on mute, Dwayne.
Thank you. Thank you. Yep, this is BERDO, Building Emission Reduction Disclosure Ordinance. Next slide, please. So here's our mission and theory of change. H builds the power communities of color and low-income communities in Massachusetts to eradicate environmental racism, classism, create healthy and sustainable communities, and achieve environmental justice. Since our founding in 1994, our members and staff have been at the forefront for the fight of environmental justice. In 2004, ACE transitioned to a member-led base building organization. We believe both community organizing and legal advocacy are necessary to remedy the impacts of systemic environmental racism. Next slide. So how did we get here? We got here basically through partner up with traditional housing advocacy partners, City Life, out of JP, Chinese Progressive Association out of Chinatown, New England United for Justice out of Dorchester and Mattapan, and NRDC was the one that fronted the resources to kind of bring this coalition together, and of course, last but not least, the city of Boston. Next slide. How was this process different? This was a resident-driven process. We organized residents to both inform and to learn from residents. One of the beautiful thing was that many of our residents had a certain expertise around emissions, building emissions. We did testimonies during public hearings, but we still engaged the residents. Currently, we are working with the city to build in the regulatory infrastructure, and we are still including residents. And we have developed a review board, which is two-thirds community stakeholders. Next slide. What does this mean for the community? Well, what it means for the community is that they are involved at all stages of this process. We didn't start with residents and then leave them out when the complexity of regulatory infrastructure was necessary. We brought the residents along. So our co-conspirators, One Square World, created a skit that follows the journey of a renter as she learns about dangers. So we even made an animated skit that really was really good that showed what many of our members, residents go through living in the city of Boston and the impact of building emissions on quality of life and public health. Next, please. Next slide. So community feedback. We heard people concerns about the improved indoor and outdoor air quality, reduced energy bills, that the process shouldn't encourage displacement and gentrification, make homes more energy efficient, create jobs for local residents. And this was during the time where COVID was we was right in the middle of the pandemic. And the beautiful thing of having Zoom and being able to communicate with our residents and how basically that improvement of indoor and outdoor air quality was so important because in many of our neighborhoods, the fatalities of COVID really was as high as any place in the state. Next slide, please. How building meet the standards, energy efficient, electric space heating, better insulation, efficient lighting, and solar panels to your buildings. The other real quick piece that we may hit on is that we was really against offsets. Our position was if you pollute in our neighborhoods, the impact should be directly impacted by the residents that feel the greatest danger, the greatest impacts of pollution. So we push back on offsets. Next slide, please. Building owners will be required to make improvements to their properties to reduce emissions, including more energy efficient appliances, improve insulation, or adding solar panels to the property. This will improve quality of life for residents and workers in those buildings. Again, if you are living next to buildings that is pushing out emissions in Chinatown, it is very important for that particular building to make changes and not to have offsets or credits that still does not relieve the impact of the pollution on residents. Next slide, please. Policy agreements. How buildings meet standards, reporting by building and by the city, hub, hardship plans, building equity funds. The center is the review board oversight and how we juggle multiple needs, the politics, the finance, the economics of this process. And we are still in the process to see if these things could actually work together. But what we are trying to do, and our goal is to have a very transparent process, and both the good should be promoted and we should tell the world, but when we have shortcomings and failures, that should be also reported out so we can continue to improve the product. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, so I said it already. Offsets are not an option. And that's probably still one of the more controversial piece, even among some of our allies. But again, if I living in Roxbury or Chinatown and we are suffering from asthma and we are suffering from pollution. We believe that offsets don't give viable solution to residents. Next slide, please. What if that not is enough? If building owners don't meet the standard, they can make a payment into a fund. We push the city to prioritize projects that benefit EJ populations, supporting housing justice and reduce displacements, and require strong standards for workers. So those resources will ideally, and we'll see how that will work out, will be directed to frontline communities that are facing the direct impact on building emissions. Next slide, please. Well, the community accountability is the review board. The 2/3 majority review board, community review board is one of the first in the city of Boston. Usually it will be 55-45 city. So when we have this 2/3 majority, we are hoping that this will focus on what we call a supermajority that could focus the needs of residents versus businesses or bureaucracies. Next, please. What if building owners can't meet the standards? Building owners can request a hardship plan from the review board. We wanted to make sure that the board could hold building owners accountable for the impact of non-compliance, which include higher energy bills and the health burden of poor air quality. Yeah, so it's not draconian. We still believe that the private sector has a major role in this conversation, and it's still an ongoing conversation. But we just want these conversations to be transparent and have some level of integrity in that process. Next slide, please. What if you have questions? Well, you can ask questions of me after the next presenter. Next slide, please. Right now, the city is drafting. We are currently drafting the regulations of BERDO 2.0. We're making progress. It is as much as a political process as a policy process. We still don't know how we'll look in real time. The community review board have met at least 2 times so far. So we are seeing how that works in the political economy of the city of Boston. And yes, that's where we are. In this imperfect process, we are trying to push this forward, and we believe that residents, a major stakeholder going forward as we think about building emissions. Thank you.
Dwayne, thank you so much for sharing your work in Boston with us today. So our final speaker today is Jack Hansen. Jack is a co-founder and the executive director at Run on Climate. At age 24, Jack was elected to the Burlington, Vermont City Council, where he served from 2019 to 2022. In his time on the council, Jack led the successful passage of a number of climate justice policies, including requirements for landlords to weatherize rental housing, renewable heating requirements for new construction, a citywide electric bike share system, a commitment and roadmap to get Burlington off fossil fuels by 2030, and more. He co-founded Run on Climate in 2021 to accelerate the passage of ambitious local climate policies in municipalities across the US. Jack, I will let you take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Cora. And thank you everyone for being here to talk about climate justice policy and what we can do at the municipal level. And Run on Climate, as Cora mentioned, we're all about accelerating local level climate policy. So we're super excited to be here and glad to see a great turnout. Happy to connect with anyone after this meeting as well if you want to talk further about any of this and collaborate. So I'm going to focus on a policy that I worked on while I was on the Burlington City Council, but really it started during my campaign, which was at the end of 2018. And it was a group of folks who wanted to see more climate action and more action on housing and economic and racial and social justice as well in Burlington. We formed this campaign, and really the centerpiece of the campaign was around this policy to require landlords in Burlington to weatherize rental units. we were really inspired by what they had done in Boulder, Colorado. So that's shown on this slide as well, the smart regs policy that passed in 2010 in Boulder. And by the time that we were launching this campaign in 2018, Boulder had already seen 97% compliance rate on that. So that really served as a model and inspiration. Next slide. So we had some clear goals that we wanted to achieve with this policy. All inefficient rental units getting weatherized as quickly as possible. That is the basis of it, and that it would be strictly enforced, and that it wouldn't, as Dwayne mentioned, displace or further harm renters who were already struggling. Next slide. So as we set out to run this campaign and fight for this policy, we of course wanted to understand the impacts. There's direct impacts as well as indirect impacts of the policy listed there, and we can keep moving for time's sake. Next slide. But I think the point being is it's not just about reducing emissions, it's also improving quality of life and reducing monthly bills for renters. So we felt like this was a very winnable campaign and really worth pushing for, that we could get something concrete here, because the enthusiasm was super high. And really, what I'm talking about here is the community organizing that we did and how we got this policy passed. I'll talk a little more about the policy itself after that. But with that community organizing, with going door to door for my campaign for this policy, there was so much excitement and enthusiasm for this, and that just kept us motivated to keep organizing and pushing. Burlington is majority renters. The district that I ran in was almost entirely renters. So there were a lot of natural allies, both with renters, but also organizations fighting for, economic and climate justice. And sure, there was this natural enemy of property owners or landlords who maybe wouldn't want to make this change, but that's a pretty small group of people. And so we had numbers on our side. If you click again, I think there's one more line on this slide, which is we had to identify, because every city is different and every city has different legal authority. So we had to identify how could we actually do this? How could we make it happen? Fortunately, all it would take in Burlington would be an ordinance change, which isn't that intensive of a process. So we did have the legal authority. Next slide. And the context we felt was really favorable. In Vermont, we campaign in the winters. We have local elections in March. So when we're knocking on doors, people are living that reality of extremely high heating bills, super uncomfortable conditions in the winter. And so it's really front of mind for people. And housing was really the top political issue at that time. We have really low housing availability and really poor quality and expensive rentals here in Burlington. It was also in the context of really no climate action happening. This was during the Trump administration, so the federal government was going the opposite direction. Our Republican governor and state government was really taking no meaningful action on climate either. And yet people in Burlington want to see climate action. So this was an opportunity to do that right at the local level. Next slide. Yeah, and obviously we had to dig deep into the policy as a team, and not everyone's going to want to go door to door and community organize, but some people might want to just do the back end research. And so we engaged in a lot of that, trying to deeply understand how this policy could be structured and work well. These are some of the questions that we tried to address as we were doing that. Next slide. We also wanted to understand who the players were and how this could happen. So understanding the process of what it would take, that's laid out up top. And then understanding who the big players are. These are some different nonprofits and for-profit agencies, utilities, service providers, et cetera, that we engage with as we were trying to push for this. Next slide. And in terms of organizing and pushing, we had an inside game and outside game. So I was elected in March of 2019. So we had me on the inside, able to get meetings with the mayor, administration, able to introduce policy, ask for research, make amendments, et cetera, as well as the outside game of mobilizing, popular support and getting people engaged. So we were able to kind of work both fronts at the same time. Next slide. We use social media to bring people into the fold as well. Had people submit photos of the conditions at their apartments. So those are some of these like finger-sized gaps indoors where air is just, flooding in the winter, broken window covered in cardboard. So just showing the problem, making it visceral, but also getting people more engaged with the work. Next slide. And then getting people out to meetings and specifically giving people a sense of what's happening, how they engage, and what they can support. So this was pulling people out to an ordinance meeting and specifically calling for a faster timeline of implementation of the policy. Next slide. Okay, so now I talked about, how we kind of push for this quickly on what the policy does, and I know I'm running out of time, but we did pass it as shown below and finalized it in 2022. Any rentals using over 50,000 BTUs per square foot have to be weatherized. For context, a lot of old buildings are well over 100,000 BTUs per square foot. New efficient buildings could be, lower than 30,000 per square foot. Next slide. There were a few exemptions, but largely it pretty much covers all year-round rentals. Next. We were able to get a pretty strong timeline in place based on starting with the least efficient buildings first coming into compliance and then working our way down that ladder. Next slide. I think this is my last slide. So I'm working on getting more data about where we're at with it so far, but it's slow with the implementation so far. Only one property has actually completed the entire process. Almost all of them are on a waiting list to receive the weatherization work. There's a huge shortage of contractors and workers to actually do the weatherization work. So that's the problem we now have to address. And I think this policy has created additional pressure in addressing that. And I think the city needs to step up in addition to what the state's doing and really develop this workforce. We need a lot more people doing this weatherization work if we're going to actually achieve our goals, both at a city and a state level. So that's kind of the next phase and where we're at.
Great. Jack, thank you so much for sharing your work with us and for this detailed case study of the development and passage of the rental efficiency ordinance. Now, Ann Wright is going to facilitate the Q&A. I've seen a lot of great questions go by, so good luck, Ann. We have many, many good questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can.
Great. How are you, everybody? I've tried a little bit to clump some of the questions I see passing by, but feel free to put something else in the Q&A. I don't know if everybody is muted or not. I don't know if they can shout out if I'm missing something, but let's get started. I can see first there are two questions about Berto, either for Dwayne or maybe Loie, Laura's and Helena's. Helena asked Dwayne, in places like East Boston, there are mostly small buildings, less than 20,000. How do you have any thoughts on how to deal with those since Berto excludes small buildings?
I think that we will develop other like retrofit. I think how it kind of fits into it is that the resources from the Berto fines and to go into the smaller buildings in the frontline communities. Also, I think it also shows that we have the potential on the municipal level, if we could deal with 20,000 square feet buildings, we believe that we could start dealing with the smaller buildings also. But it's going to be a political organizing process. But there should be resources, especially with this EPA, DOE money that coming down, that we could start positioning the smaller buildings to get retrofitted also. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura asks, in the Berto process, how many renters were involved, and how did you include renters at a range of incomes?
We had over 200 folks. Most of it was renters, and we went through our Right to the City Boston Coalition, which is the base building housing organizations in the city of Boston. So that's how we organized the renters. This wasn't a purely a EJ process. It was basically doing some intersectionality with our housing advocate partners. So it was an education for both sides to start seeing building emissions as a housing issue. Because in the past, housing was just basically keep getting people housed. Now, especially during the COVID, like how do we keep people healthy in housing, both internal, external exposure of housing. So we are doing more work with our housing advocates to integrate building emissions work. Thank you.
Nice, thank you. Lo, you don't have anything to add? Okay, thank you.
Dwayne said it all. Thank you,
Okay.
Dwayne.
Lisa has an interesting question here about the role of cap agencies. They normally decarbonize low-income multi-units, but if 50% of the units in an apartment building are low income, they can get the whole building done. But then there's a barrier that if the landlord pays for the utilities in unit, then that unit isn't eligible to get energy work done through the cap agency, even if they're low-income people. So is there anybody addressing this problem? Does anybody know?
No, that definitely sounds like something that should be brought up to the EEAC as an advocacy issue. The nexus between the four different parts of Mass Save, the market and low income and the small and the large quadrants, is those nexuses are very complicated and burdensome. So there is a listening session this Friday afternoon, and just sent out a reminder about that. And people could bring that up to the EAC, which is the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council, which oversees the Mass Save program and in particular, the design of the 3-year plan.
Yeah, and just to be clear, Loie, the BEA is hosting a meeting of people who want to think about giving feedback and attending those listening sessions. The listening session of the EAC is on the 9th, I believe. And my email this morning, I think says that clearly.
Okay, I read it too quickly.
Yeah,
I apologize for mischaracterizing it.
Very confusing. Great. Craig Foley put some comments in here about the IRA and can't the IRA be used for some of these. One of you presenters responded that most of the IRA is restricted to non-principal residences, buildings that have owner residence. But then Craig put in that the tax credits 179D and 45L have now been altered to be able to be applied to rentals. So I don't know if anybody knows anything more about that, but the BEA has done a little bit of, two webinars on those tax credits. So some of that information is available in our slides.
I apologize if my answer was incorrect and out of date. I would be very interested in learning about the IRA funding that is available for rental units.
Great, I'll make a note of that.
Thank you.
And also we have a lot of our CDC partners that traditionally use different types of tax credits that may be more applicable to what they can do. That's a very interesting conversation. They own the building, but they have renters. So that's a good question that I would love to ask our CDC partners, how they could utilize it.
Great. Thank you. There are a few questions here for Jack. Kathleen Scanlon asks, how did you collect the data to identify the buildings that needed to comply?
Yeah, so we have, as I think other states do in Vermont, you can't disclose information on an individual unit basis about energy use. It's a privacy issue or privacy protection for renters, and I think for everyone. But you can get it on the building level because that doesn't disclose any individual unit. So we're able to get building level data from the gas utility. They could have refused to give us that data, and I'm not sure what would have happened, but they did. They gave the city that data, and our electric utility is municipal, so that's been really helpful in all of this because they've been actively pushing for it, and they partner with the gas utility on efficiency programs, and they were able to get the data from the gas utility, which is private.
That is excellent. I know we're struggling with that in Massachusetts, so we'll have to go talk to Vermont. Susan Murphy asks, Jack, on the Burlington program, how does the city know what the BTU per square feet is for these properties?
That's yeah, same answer essentially. We got the data from the natural gas. Pretty much all buildings use natural gas, and that's what we're targeting here. And we got the data directly from the gas utility. We already have data on the size of the buildings, and then so we just got the usage data.
Yeah, so it came in the whole data package from the utilities. You didn't have to match it with city data on square footage.
The square footage, I think we maybe already had that, but I'm not sure if we got that from the utility or if we already had it. I think the electric utility or code enforcement may have already had the square footage.
Okay. A couple more for Jack. Helena asks, do you publicly post these EUIs?
The data, if that's talking about the data, I don't think we've publicly posted the data. I can follow up on that though, and I put my email in the chat and happy to follow up further, but I don't think so, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, thank you. Couple more for Jack. Karen from Acton asks, how did your weatherization process interact with income eligible programs? Was there a lot of red tape?
Yeah, that's a good one. I should have mentioned this. There's big incentives available, and even before this policy, there were big incentives available for weatherization of rental properties. For if the tenants are low income, they can, and this may have changed in the intervening time, but if the tenants are low income, the landlord can pretty much get it for free, get the weatherization for free. And then for all others, they can usually get 50 to 75% of the costs covered by the utilities, and there's good financing available for the rest of the costs. So that's a key piece that really made this a lot easier to get done politically, is there was a lot of money available.
Great. She has a couple questions. I want to see if we can quickly get through those, and then at least one more question, and then probably time to close up. Karen also asked, did building management companies come on board to help you? And are you getting any negative feedback due to the slow process? And have you created benchmarks to meet your goal?
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure which one to answer. I mean, the property owners obviously didn't really want to do this, but they didn't fight super hard. I mean, we had organized such popular support and had such strong political support. I think it was hard for them to stick their neck out and be, the big bad landlord opposing it. So they were relatively pretty quiet about it, I would say. And the other question, the benchmark, I mean, the policy obviously has very strict specific deadlines and dates. The property owners, if they're on a waiting list, they get more time. And so that's the issue that we're in right now, is that they're pretty much all just on these waiting lists because there's such a backlog of weatherization projects. So that's kind of the issue, is that, and the only way to move forward is we have to address workforce. Otherwise, this is just impossible. So like I said, that's basically our next step at this point. But we will continue to monitor, and we have data on all the properties, where they're at, where they are on the waiting list, et cetera.
Well, good work. We're just a couple minutes from the end. Susan Olshoff has her hand up. Or is it Susan Hoag? Susan Hoag has her hand up. Can we take that and then we'll close up, and other questions, I guess, can be answered by emailing our presenters.
I was just going to say how wonderful that you got the city behind you before you started going into these low-income family homes, because what we found in Gloucester is that many of the low-income people do not realize what they can get. There's all this money coming down through the cap agencies, but they're not aware of it. And the red tape that they have to go through is beyond what some of them can do. And so they need a lot of support. The money is out there, but how to get it to these rental buildings, either through the renter or through the landlord, is a little bit more difficult than just saying it's out there, you can do it. That's what we found. And we're lucky today that we have a grant from MassDEC to work both on the one-to-one with renters and landlords, and also on a more global approach with actually Craig Foley here on the webinar to run webinars or in-house workshops for these landlords to come in and hear first time. And then we can keep touch with them. We've got their names. We keep calling them. Have you done this? What about that? It's slow work, but that's what we found works for Gloucester, at least up to this point. We're hoping things will go a little faster in the future. Thank you.
Any comment on that, Jack, or anyone?
Just the one quick thing I would say on it is, I think, yeah, there's red tape for landlords that want to get this money, but if you make it mandatory, they'll figure it out. Usually they'll find the money, and obviously you want to be available to help, and you are, but I think the biggest thing to get them to navigate that is by requiring it.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody. I do see more questions in the Q&A and a hand or two up, but I think we need to respect our presenters' time. So I want to thank everybody, especially our presenters, Jack, Dwayne, Loie, and Alexander, for your excellent presentations and so much information. And of course, all your day-to-day work over many years.